rather than specifically the individual and finding out if we can actually underwrite the individual itself like most traditional banks. We don't actually look at that. We know that investors are and financials are pretty complex. We want to kind of stay focused on the property itself and making sure that that property calculates a good return for the lender and the investor.
Welcome to the VIP Financial Education YouTube channel, where we help you go further, faster financially. I'm your host today, Michael Matthew. Guys, thanks for joining us. We've got a great video ahead today as part of our investor resource series. And what we're doing in this series is going out, we're finding resources, we're bringing tips, tricks, hacks here on the channel and exposing you to them in hopes that they can help you in some way, shape, or form to really navigate some of the uncertain times that are going on in the real estate investment world right now. As a full-time investor for a number of years at this point, I can't stress enough how important it is to have access to capital, whether it's your own capital, whether it's leveraging your own capital or your own credit to use OPM, other people's money, which we often talk about here on the channel. Access to capital is imperative. So be sure to stick through all the way to the end of today's video. We've got a resource on here that you're going to have the access to tap into. That being said, we've got a phenomenal guest that I'm going to introduce here in just a second. He's going to be talking today about private money lending. We're going to be talking about the pros and cons of that versus institutional versus hard money, some of the differences between that, when you should use one versus the other, and ultimately, if it's a good fit, how you can access David and his team to help you grow your real estate investment portfolio. So he's back on the channel here for a second time today by popular demand. And guys, we don't take that lightly. If we're getting negative feedback, we're not getting good positive comments about the resources that we bring here, we just don't bring them back, plain and simple. It's been the complete opposite of that for David. He's actively working with a number of channel viewers that saw him on previous episodes, and they're working through deals as we speak right now. So we thought it was a phenomenal time to bring him back. That being said, welcome back to the channel, Mr. David Yeat with fortknox Capital.
Hey, thank you for having me again, Michael. I appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate you taking time out of your day. We know how busy you are. So one of the things that we really want to kind of dive into first and foremost is, what is private money lending? What does that look like versus, an institutional mortgage, for example? And if you could kind of start by talking about some of the pros and cons of each.
Sure. So private lending basically focuses on specifically investors. Our main goal is to just focus on investors only, on investor properties that they're looking to actually purchase, whether it be single family homes, 1 to 4 units, or mixed use properties, multifamilies, any scope of properties that you're looking to actually purchase, whether it be for a investment purpose. We look at stuff like that and qualify these investors primarily on the property, on what some people may know as DSCR, the debt service coverage of the property itself, rather than specifically the individual and finding out if we can actually underwrite the individual itself like most traditional banks do. We don't actually look at that. We know that investors and financials are pretty complex. We want to kind of stay focused on the property itself and making sure that that property calculates a good return for the lender and the investor.
So in essence, it's a math problem for you guys. It's different than an institutional loan, for example, because you guys are really more concerned with the performance of the subject property as opposed to necessarily the individual that is going to be taking on the debt. So you guys are feeding that into your formula and it spits out a certain number. And based on that, you guys, you and your company of private lending decide whether or not it's a deal that you guys want to move forward, if it kind of checks those boxes, but you're not so much as looking under the hood of the borrower themselves as far as some of the underwriting guidelines like an institutional lending would come with. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's probably pretty spot on there, actually. So yeah,
I got lucky. I get lucky sometimes.
You can read into me a little bit better than I can personally. But yes, you are right that we actually focus on specifically the actual property itself, making sure that the property itself does make sense and makes money. We don't care about the individual itself. We care about the individual, but we don't actually have to underwrite him to a point where we have to consider what is what is his overall personal expenses, because we don't focus on lending on a personal individual. We solely focus on the actual business of the business of the company that he's actually going to be underwriting or loaning on, and the actual property.
Got it. So would you say that that would be the biggest pro, is avoiding some of those underwriting guidelines a lot of people can get hung up with? I mean, anyone that's watching the channel right now that has gone through any type of mortgage process through a B of A or a Wells Fargo, any institutional lender out there is going to know that even when you get into underwriting, you think you've provided every single piece of documentation. You're supposed to close on the loan in 2 days, and they're still asking you for more and more to get you to the finish line. So we've all been there before. So and your model, they're not necessarily jumping through all of those hoops. You're taking a look at the deal as a whole up front. And then if the deal as a whole makes sense, and then you're kind of going through that underwriting process. But the property itself is being first looked at, not necessarily checking the credit of the individual that's looking to borrow.
That's correct.
Okay, so that would be the biggest pro to it. What would you say the biggest con would be? I mean, there's going to be a flip side of the coin on every deal that's out there, every kind of resource that we bring here on the channel. We always want to hear the good, the bad, and the ugly. We owe it to our channel audience to paint the picture both ways. What would be a con, with private money versus institutional money?
Probably, I would say the higher rates. Right.
Can you dive into that a little bit more? Now, how high above prime would they be, and what does that kind of look like?
So the rates aren't actually that much more higher if you actually consider all the facts. So banks obviously have actual lower rates if you qualify specifically for what they're looking for, right? Where
it's a big if.
Right. Yeah, it is, because they're FDIC insured. They're actually investing other depositors' money, so they want to make sure that it's very, very clean in a sense of it's very safe, right? They don't like to take on very risque type of projects like private lenders do. It's because we're actually focusing on specifically investors that are actually investing in risky type of projects. Obviously, every project is going to be risky. We try to minimize it as much as we can to the exposure rate of what we actually lend on our money on, right? So obviously, if you're saying that, oh, this is completely risky, and we want to borrow $1 million with no money out of our pocket, and we need another $2 million on that just to do the construction of it, and our credit scores are 500, but you understand us. Right, we do pretty well. You see our track record. Okay, great. Here's a 20% interest rate.
Right.
And, you're all good, right? Well, of course, has to make sense, right? You can't expect that specific risk for a specific bank in itself, like Bank of America, for instance, or any other local FDIC insured bank to take on.
Well, I think it's just not a one-size-fits-all approach. You guys just don't have that cookie-cutter approach to lending. Since you don't have the regulation of the FDIC, it is a group of accredited private investors that their risk aversion is going to be different than obviously an institutional lender is going to be. So that's what you guys can bring, is really that flexibility to the table on these deals. So that being said, if you're an investor watching right now, who should target private money for one of their upcoming projects? What would that look like? What would be the demographic of that?
Sure. Beginners to all the way seasoned, experienced investors, right? Where they're moving quite quickly, and they're actually buying and selling all the time, specifically, and they don't have the time to actually go through the hoops of a 90-day close like a traditional bank does. Right? You try to close within anywhere between 2 to 4 weeks. That's our goal. For an investor, it'll be quite difficult for anybody to actually move on and do a lot of projects in the future if they have to constantly wait 60 to 90 days on a specific close, right? Time's money.
No, and I think that that's spot on. It's a tool for the tool belt. So, we're not saying completely go away from institutional money. We're not saying necessarily go away from hard money if you've gone after hard money in the past. Having access to as many sources of capital as possible is going to be a big time benefit as they're growing their portfolio, because again, it's not a one size fits all approach. They might have a deal that the timing on it is, they need the money yesterday. And if you guys have the ability to turn, the capital around in a week or 2 weeks or even 3 weeks, as opposed to a 2 or 3 month window where you're waiting for underwriting for institutional money, we all know out there in the real estate world right now that a lot of contingencies are not even being put into offers. And B, these houses are flying off the shelf so fast that if you're waiting 2 or 3 months to get your bank approval for a specific property, odds are it's already going to be gone. So institutional money is good in certain circumstances, like David's saying here, if you kind of have that rush job, if you will, and you need to go through that process very quickly in order to tie up the asset, then private money might be something that you want to take a really, really serious look at. What would some other circumstances be that would fall into that?
Sure. So what I would probably, the best way to answer that is probably tell you a little bit more about what others have come to me for and why we should probably avoid that, right? So I've got quite a few deals in the past 3 weeks now, out of nowhere, and they're trying to close on the deal, but they're trying to close ASAP. They need to say, oh, I need to close in a week, by the end of the month, 2 weeks, because of this, this, and this. Sometimes they've actually gone to local banks and they try to get funding. And sometimes the bank says, okay, great, we'll get you done. They say they can do it. But what happens is after a few weeks, a month after month, literally 3 months gone by, and they say, oh, we can't actually fund we can't fund on this project no more for whatever the reason. Right. And they come to us at the last minute and says, hey, listen, I need to close like yesterday. And what they need to do is, come to us and say, hey, you know what, I don't care about your rate. Just can you do me a favor and get this closed?
Sure.
We try to accommodate as much as possible. Obviously, the biggest aspects of it is the appraisal. If we can actually validate the appraisal and title work. But other than that, sometimes depending on the project, depending on the asset class and what we do, we actually have to do our due diligence on every single deal. But that's one of the premises that we come through a lot, is that people think that they can actually get funding through regular banks and sometimes even other lenders for that matter. And they going through the rabbit hole and find out later on they don't get financing.
Sure. No, and that's it.
Usually poor planning, to be honest, when it comes to getting your deal done. Whether it be they don't know, or the bank itself is changing their guidelines because of fluctuations of inflation and the program changes. There's a lot of things that happen on the back end that we don't know. But generally speaking, what I've seen the most is most people come from a traditional bank trying to get that funding because they've all perhaps gone through funding with them before or never had, and they find out later on that they don't have enough money in their own bank account,
Sure.
Whatever the case may be.
Yeah, no, I think those are really good examples of that. So an example A, it's people that knew ahead of time that they had to do a quick turnaround on getting financing. They knew enough to know that they couldn't go the institutional route in order to put the deal together in time. And then B was having it as a backstop, which is always important, guys, in a deal, and particularly in real estate investing. There are going to be curveballs. Things are going to happen at that 11th hour. Having a backstop for financing, so you're not just losing the deal. So if something starts to go south with financing there at the last minute, a resource like fortknox Capital can come in and ultimately help you save the day. So love that. On the flip side, let's paint the other picture. So you wouldn't have a dog in the fight in the institutional loans, obviously they would get, but if you were an investor watching from home, and you were listening to yourself, what would you want to hear about why they would want to go after institutional money or traditional financing as opposed to private lending?
So okay, so there's definitely institutional lenders out there, right? And but and the only time you would maybe focusing on something like that is if you already have an established relationship, to be quite honest, right? Because if you're in the beginning of your, or even in the middle of your phase, right, of your career, institutional investors have this one little cookie box of what they're specifically looking for, and usually they're more so for large developments, right? Because institutional investors don't specifically have the time and bandwidth to actually focus on smaller deals, like, and not to say that I'm a convenience store per se, but they don't have the time and bandwidth to actually focus on the small loans anywhere between 100 to 2 million. They're looking for $10+ million on certain deals. You know what I mean? Sure. They want to have a good return inside, good return on their investment. So they want to make sure that they have a good, the least amount of exposure with the most amount of return, with a large capital loan, if you will, rather than the smaller ones.
Got it. So just kind of the size of the deal can also play into that as well. If you're looking at development deals or larger, multi-unit, complexes like apartments, for example, it would probably make a lot more sense to go that route than going with a private lending route where you guys are more kind of laser focused on, the onesie twosies or the 4-unit or some of the, kind of smaller projects that are out there. Not that those are small, guys. That's where most investors cut their teeth. It is the exception to the rule that people are out there taking on tens and 20s and 30s of millions of dollars to do big investment projects. So there is institutional money out there, but having David and his team obviously is just another feather in your cap, so that any deal that comes across your desk, you've got the ability to put that together. So if you're watching, you already like what you hear, you like what you see, you want to have access to David and his team to see if it's a good fit, go ahead and email fortknox@vipfinancialeducation.com. We'll go ahead and drop that link below, include Fort Knox conversation in the subject line, as well as your first, your last name, and the best number to reach you in the body of the email. And someone from David or his team will get back to you ASAP. A couple things that you touched on there, David, that I want to just kind of tie down. So sure. You said the closings typically are within kind of a 2 to 4 week window on average from the time they come into your sales pipeline, if you will, until they've actually got the capital deployed out to them and sitting in their account. They can count on, a couple, 2-3 weeks for that turnaround.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's our goal, is between the 2 to 4 week turn time. And again, it's generally when we actually have everything in place, meaning we have title, we have appraisal, and sometimes we can actually even close sooner than that, to be quite honest, on specific deals, certain areas, whatnot, and asset class. So it's not it's not a cookie cutter in every single city, state, and infill. So 2 to 4 weeks is definitely our goals, or what we're looking to shoot for. But again, we sometimes have issues with title, and it happens all the time. It has more than you ever want to know. And appraisals sometimes come back, and sometimes these appraisers are so swamped in the industry itself. Certain amount of appraisers that can actually do specific types of appraisals, whether it be a certified or whether a regular appraiser or a certified appraiser or an MAI appraiser. There's quite a few. But yeah, so depending on that and their workload, sometimes they get us appraisal back, and sometimes they're not as clean as we want it to be. So what happens is we'll send that back and says, hey, can you clean this up a little bit, clarify this, clarify that, and correct this to our liking. So sometimes that takes another few days and all that. So sometimes these closings can't close as fast as we can, just for those two fundamental aspects, appraisals and title. But some of them I've worked in the past, so sometimes they're just like, bam, they're really quick, they got it. And sometimes it's just a draw of luck that everything's there, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it costs a little bit more for it, but if the deal itself deems a fast closing, hey, pay the premium, and then move on, right? So that happens when we do just that. As long as we can all accommodate each other for that. But yeah.
Yeah, I like that. There's just, I mean, moral of the story with you guys and your team is there's just not a one size fits all approach to it. So I'm not going to hold your feet to the fire on the 2 to 4 weeks, but anyone, again, that has been through that mortgage process knows that it can take significantly longer than that. And you can ultimately fall out at any time during underwriting there as well. So again, having this as, kind of that backstop is always going to make sense. You mentioned something else. You talked about seasoned investors. So when you guys are analyzing a deal or you're analyzing an investor that brings a deal to the table, is there any significance to it being their first deal versus being their 10th or their 20th? Do they get some sort of preferential treatment? Do they get better rates? If you can kind of touch on that, that was interesting.
Sure. So that's a great question. And we do focus on experienced investors, just like banks do when they look at the way banks actually underwrite specific investors or anybody that's looking for a loan. They actually like to qualify the actual individual itself. Usually they go off of like, can I see your tax returns and all that stuff? That's because that's how traditionally how they underwrite deals, right? And basically underwrite exposure for their loans. With us, we really just focus on the individual's experience. So now specifically in the experience within what scope of investments you're looking into, right? So if you have experience in fixing and flipping property, and we have a track record of showing on title, showing that you actually did this, and this, and you flipped it with a good, healthy profit, we see it, or you fixed it, you rehabbed it, fixed it, rehabbed it, and refinanced it, right? With a traditional bank or one of us, doesn't matter. But we show that there's a progression, right? So that's a track record, right? But if you're doing this your first time on fixing and flipping a property, you're a new investor, right? Regardless if you have other properties as rental properties, because some people buy stabilized properties all the time, right? They might have 10, 20, 30 properties underneath their belt, but never have they ever rehab the property or fix and flip the property. That takes talent, right? Even if you're not doing it yourself, you're doing the due diligence on hiring the right people, getting the right team, getting it done ASAP, and turning it and making a profit, whether it be selling it or refinancing it down the road.
Yeah, I mean, there's always, a lot of hair on the dog when it comes to fix and flips. I mean, you can do almost everything right. If you make just a few mistakes along the way, obviously the deal can be all for naught and can cost people without experience a lot of money up front. So totally get that. But that being said, if they have not done a project in the past, should they immediately exclude themselves from utilizing private lending, or do you guys still take a look at the deal and then you're kind of moving forward from there?
Yeah, no, not at all. So we can lend on individuals with zero experience, regardless of that, and fix and flip properties, right? But we would want to make sure that there's other mitigating factors that actually show us that, hey, we should give this guy a fair shot, get him invested. We will always give everybody the fair shot of actually getting funding, but we will reduce our exposure, which will be, so we'll lower the loan to value in itself. We'll lower the after repair value just to make sure we're comfortable with the exposure in itself.
Got it. No, that makes perfect sense. All right, guys, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up the video today. As always, go ahead and go out there and do your research. We can bring a ton of content here on the channel, but we're always going to encourage you to go out there and do some digging on your own behalf. If you like info like this, you want us to continue to bring guests like David and his expertise here on the channel, go ahead and smash that thumbs up button below. That's going to help out our ever-changing YouTube algorithm. If you're not a subscriber already, go ahead and subscribe and make sure you ding that bell notification. That's going to give you an alert as we bring new additional videos here on the channel. We drop a few new ones every week, so we look forward to seeing you on the next one. And until then, make it a great day and take care.